One of my frustrations is, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions, at pushing the capabilities. God bless my smart friends who are doing that, but we're not really investing comparably in trying to understand the transition. And there's lots of examples in the past where we got it really terribly wrong, and a lot of people were hurt. And I see us barreling towards a similar outcome if we're not careful.
Hello, and welcome to The Most Interesting Thing in AI from Rethink, The Atlantic's creative marketing studio, in collaboration with PwC, a leader in helping organizations use AI. Since the beginning of the AI boom, I, like lots of other people, have been really interested in this question about whether it's going to create new jobs, whether it will make jobs go away, whether it will make us more equal, whether it will make the world less equal. One of the people whose work I always read is Erik Brynjolfsson. He was the first person to make the argument to me that actually maybe AI will lead to less income inequality. He publishes paper after paper after paper looking at these huge questions, examining questions like, why is it that most people feel like lots of jobs are going to go away, but when they're asked about their own job, they're like, nah, I don't think my job's going to go away. He gets deep into all of this. So I was really happy to go out to Stanford University, where he's a professor, sit down with him at the edge of the foothills, and ask him about all of these questions. Here's my conversation with Erik Brynjolfsson. Erik, welcome to The Most Interesting Thing in AI.
Great to be here.
First question. Behind me, over my left shoulder, there are a number of seminal books, AI books, and a book about Paul Tsongas. Why is that there?
When I was a college student, I went down to Washington, D.C. I was an intern. You can be like an intern, unpaid intern. I came away learning so much about Washington. And the good news is I actually came away less cynical. Everybody on his team was like so idealistic, trying to make the world a better place. So it was a good summer.
The rare listeners under the age of 40, who is Paul Tsongas?
Oh, he was a senator from Massachusetts.
My home state.
He ran for president later, actually. Kind of like this, quote, new Democrat.
Was it in 92 he was running against Bill Clinton, or was it 88?
Good question. I think it was
Dukakis
92.
Is 84,
it was 92.
So it's 92.
It was 92. Yeah, exactly. But so he's like this new young generation of Democrats trying to reform the party, and I learned a lot.
All right, well, let's talk about AI. You've had a remarkable year where you've published a series of seminal papers where you've taken on some of the biggest questions in AI and found kind of creative sideways ways of getting to answers that help us understand where things are going. Your most recent one was an effort to figure out how valuable AI is to consumers.
Right.
Explain the methodology and explain what you found. This came out a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. So we want to ask, what is generative AI worth? And most people don't pay anything. They just get it for free. But that doesn't mean we don't get value. We get value from Wikipedia. We get value from this podcast, even if you don't pay for it. And more goods and services are becoming free. So economists have this concept called consumer surplus, which is the most you'd be willing to pay for something versus what you actually have to pay. Like maybe I'd be willing to pay, $150 for this sweater. If I only had to pay $50, I get $100 of consumer surplus. With free goods, the ratio is infinite, but the numbers can be very big. So what we did was we asked a bunch of people, how much would we have to pay you to stop using ChatGPT or other types of generative AI for a month?
And these are people who are using it for their own personal use cases, figuring out whatever.
We asked, we did a broad survey of people who are using for business, people using it for consumer uses. And what we found was, and we've done this a couple of times now. So last year, we had to pay people about $98 to get them to stop using ChatGPT for a month. That was the average value. Now, some people it was way more. A lot of people it was like nothing or very little. So there's a whole range of different values. When we did the survey again earlier this year, it was about $125. So the value's been going up. Also, more and more people have been using it. Just that there's diffusion, there's adoption that's spreading. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but when you net the two out, it was about $170 billion worth of value when you multiply the value per person times the number of people using it. So there's a huge amount of consumer surplus being generated.
So there are a couple of implications of that. One is that the AI companies could price their models much higher. Right now, there's a competitive market.
No, not necessarily. Yeah, exactly. If they all work together and
a little bit of collusion, right?
If they did collusion, which would be illegal. But yeah, competition keeps them from doing that. Also, they want to gain market share by subsidizing it. So I don't think it necessarily means they could raise it to that level. I mean, the good news, Adam Smith would be very happy. The invisible hand of competition forces them to pass on a lot of the value to consumers.
But the most interesting implication is that there is this big question, and I want to talk about it in depth later, about why you have these incredibly powerful tools that aren't really yet showing up in the productivity statistics, right?
I'm happy to talk about that. It's something I've thought a lot about.
And so your thesis would be, they kind of are, we're just measuring productivity wrong.
That's part of it. There's two things going on. So one is that mismeasurement. And so there's a ton of value that's not showing up, especially as the economy changes. Our GDP metrics are not meant to capture this. So we're pioneering a new metric. We call it GDP-B, not super creative, but the B stands for benefits.
Yep.
So instead of GDP basically measures all the things that are bought and sold in the economy. But if something has zero price, with few exceptions, it has zero weight in GDP. Right. Which maybe isn't a problem in the 20th century when most of the economy was like tons of steel or cars or apples or whatever, things that you buy. But now as more and more things are free and digital, we're missing a bigger share of the economy. The average American spends almost half their waking hours, between 7 and 8 hours, looking at screens like this TV screen or the computer screen or your phone. So they're consuming, they're voting with their time that this free digital stuff is very valuable to them. It's just not priced. So GDP-B is going and systematically measuring not just generative AI, but we're doing this for a basket of hundreds of goods, eventually thousands of goods, to see where the value is being created, compare that to where the money is being spent. So that's part of the story. There's another part of the story which has to do with that we call it the productivity J-curve, that it just takes time for companies and individuals to rethink how they use the technology in ways that create value. That's a longer story we can get into later.
Well, no, let's talk about the J-curve, because when I go and I talk to a conference of business executives, and let's say they're CFOs in the room, and I say, how many of you have seen a 1% or better increase in your productivity or output because of AI? Very few hands go up.
That's right.
And one hypothesis is that they're on the downward slope of the J-curve.
Exactly.
Right? And that's what you believe?
Well, we're just turning the corner, I think. So the reason it's called a J-curve is exactly what you say, that when you first have a very powerful technology, a general purpose technology like AI or electricity, to get full value of it, you have to rethink how companies organize. If you just slap it on top of what you're already doing, you don't get most of the value. That reorganization of work is costly and difficult. It involves inventing new business processes, creating what we call organizational capital or intangible assets, also new skills like just learning how to do it better. That investment in, we call it intangible assets, is huge. It can be much bigger, up to 10 times bigger than the direct investment in the technology, the computers and the software. But it mostly isn't measured. So what you have is a bunch of effort going into reinventing and creating intangible assets, no additional output right away. And so that looks like negative productivity, or at least flat productivity. Then later you start harvesting it, and then you get the upward part of the J-curve. And we're just turning the corner.
But what is the evidence that we're turning the corner? Because you could have a couple of things, right? You could have a very deep J-curve, and we're just actually at the beginning of the descent. You could have a J-curve that isn't really a J-curve, it's just a downward line. Like, how do you know, A, that it's a J-curve, and B, that we're turning the corner at the bottom?
So we've done a lot of research on other examples of J-curves going back to electricity, software, computers, and this pattern emerges over and over, even going back to the steam engine. So it's a very common pattern, and it's rational, actually, to invest in these intangible assets and then harvest them later. As to what's happening right now, so there's several different things. First off, we've done specific studies of applications. And even though I see the same thing when I talk to executives, most of them aren't getting benefit, there are sort of these islands where they are getting big benefit. I did a study of call centers with Lindsay Raymond and Daniel Lee. We found up to a 30% productivity gain within just a few months from some of the people, especially for the less skilled workers. Other people have done studies of software, management consulting, sales, elsewhere. So you do have opportunities to create lots of benefit. And it's beginning to show up also in some of the employment statistics. We can show that later. And even just at inkling, and I wouldn't put too much weight on this, but it's encouraging. There used to be this saying, we see AI everywhere, but in the productivity statistics, we can't say that anymore because, last year, 2025, productivity was about 2.2%, which was significantly higher, almost double what it had been averaging the previous 10 years. And I don't want to go by just 1 year, but my own estimate is that we're going to continue seeing higher and higher productivity growth at the aggregate level as these individual studies sort of diffuse, and more people are using it in those ways that they're getting, in many cases, double-digit productivity gains.
But there are a couple of reasons why this might not happen. So I love AI. I use it all the time. I've got all these agent farms running constantly. Like, wake up in the morning, I check what's happening in all these different projects. It's amazing. But a couple things happen. One, it's not clear that any of these projects are actually contributing to the Atlantic and not just creating more work for other people, as we figured out. Now, maybe it's the way I've run them. But there is this phenomenon of, because AI removes the barriers to create work or to make a PowerPoint or to do something, you can actually just create work for other people, right? So there's one. And then two, there's this question of how quickly AI comes into an organization. And if it comes in too quickly, you can disrupt the whole organization and you can create a whole bunch of chaos that then lowers productivity. So you're pretty confident that those two things may be true. There may be cases, but they're massively overwhelmed by the good that's going to come.
That's exactly right. Let me give you 4 pieces of evidence why I'm super confident. And by the way, I put my money where my mouth is. Bob Gordon and I made a bet about productivity growth in the 2020s. I'm already ahead, even at this early part of the J curve. I'm sure I'm gonna crush it. In fact, he says he realizes he's gonna win.
What are the exact terms of the bet?
So the official Congressional Budget Office had a productivity growth projection of about 1.4% per year for the 2020s, which is what it had been historically. So they just sort of extrapolated, which I don't blame them for doing that. I said, look, I'm visiting companies. I'm seeing amazing things happening. I think it's going to be much higher than that. So I bet it's going to be more than 1.4. And Bob's a better negotiator. He said, well, let's make the cutoff 1.8%. So you have to win by a bit. And I said, fine, we'll make it 1.8%. So if it wins that, then basically I buy him a fancy dinner. And if not, he buys me a fancy dinner. And so right now we're already a little bit ahead of that number. Jason Furman has a nice little chart where he shows how we're doing, and I think the best is yet to come. But let me give you 4 reasons why I'm pretty confident. First, look, anyone who's worked with the technology like you have and I have, it's just breathtaking, like what it can do. Like it's so obvious that so many cognitive tasks can be like 10 times better with the technology. Not all of them, but enough of them. And it's clear when I talk to my friends, I have some skeptic friends as well, most people aren't using more than like a tiny fraction.
Right.
At my company, WorkHelix, we see these like power laws in every company we visit where there's a few super users that are like 10x, and the median user, the long tail, most people are barely scratching the surface.
Right. So and they're like using the wrong models.
Yeah. And they're just like, they're using it to make their emails more eloquent, which is nice, but doesn't really change. There's other people who are like creating, intensively better marketing plans or code or whatever that they would normally have taken them weeks or months. So just when you look at the capabilities, which I think is to me like right off the bat, I'm already convinced. But then you go and you do the studies, and we've done a few of these studies, other people have, where you can do causal evidence of what's happened when they roll out AI in a phased way. So some people get access to it, some people don't get access. You can do comparisons. You can use synthetic differences and differences. Some of the techniques that my Nobel Prize winning neighbors here have developed to separate correlation from causality. When you do those, almost all the studies show significant productivity gains for the people who are rolling it out. Not all of them. There are some that had negative effects, but it's like 10 to 1 in favor of not just small productivity gains, but big ones. The third thing is that we're beginning to see evidence in the labor market. So I did this paper, Canaries in the Coal Mine, with Bharat Chandar and Ruyu Chen, and I was a little surprised that you could actually see that there are sectors, the ones that you'd expect to be most affected by AI, you're already seeing employment effects there. And we could talk more about that, but that suggests that the early stage of these changes. And then last but not least, not insignificant, but something I want to keep an eye on, is just the aggregate numbers finally are beginning to be consistent with some productivity gain. There's a lot of noise, there's tariffs, there's wars, there's recessions, all sorts of things can happen. But at least in the aggregate numbers, it's beginning to show up what we would expect to show up. I anticipate that will grow. But when you put all those 4 things together, to me, it's a slam dunk case.
It is kind of remarkable that AI is so powerful it can almost counteract all the terrible political decisions we make as a country.
Let's hope.
Let me ask you about each of those 4 areas, because they're all extremely interesting. Okay, so let's talk about employees becoming 10 times more productive.
Yeah.
And so I can imagine certain areas where an employee becomes 10 times more productive and you either just pay them more or you want more employees, right? Like, oh my gosh, there's infinite demand for this product. They can produce 10 times as many. Let's have more people do it, right?
Right.
But then you can also imagine some areas where, wait, an employee can do it 10 times faster. I need 1/10 as many employees.
That's right.
So describe which are the jobs where, assume 10x improvement. Which are the jobs where that will mean more people, better paid, where it will mean fewer people, and actually, where will it be like wage deflationary? Where will you have the same number of people but just pay them less?
Okay. Well, first off, you're way ahead of the game because you considered both those cases. Right. Almost everybody I talk to only considers one or the other.
Well, but I'm a boss, right? If I had engineers who could write 10 times as much code, I would hire more engineers, not fewer.
Good for you, because I just met with the CFO of this very large company, and she was like, we want to have hard measures of the performance of AI. The next thing she said was, therefore, we're going to measure how much headcount reduction there is in each division. And I was like, okay, that's one measure you could have. And I totally get why it's the easiest thing for you to count, and you like to count things. But I said, you're a CFO. Your job actually is to be like, come up with new KPIs, new key performance indicators of how's your customer satisfaction, how many new products, which quality. And I know it's harder than just counting headcount, but most people just gravitate towards like cutting costs.
Yeah.
And nothing wrong with cutting costs. It's just that I think it's less than half the story. Most of it's on the other side. Now, to get to your question, there are these two different things. I'm an economist, and so I hope I don't give your viewers PTSD by bringing them back to freshman economics. But there's downward sloping demand curves. That means that as price gets lower, quantity increases. So you get like a curve that's downward. Sorry, I don't have a whiteboard here. I'm tempted to stand up.
The hand
I would
is fine.
start writing Greek equations. So we got this downward sloping demand curve. If the curve is very steep.
Actually, we pause for a second. If you're listening to this, I would like you to stream the audio and see if you can have your AI model draw the graphs that Erik is describing. This will be a fun experiment. Now go back to it.
That would be amazing. I'll soon be replaced by that. But this downward sloping demand curve, if it's very steep, that is a big drop in price leads to only a small increase in quantity, then you end up spending less and less. And there's many occupations that are like agriculture. It used to be, we all know, like 90% of Americans were doing it. And now it's maybe 2% because even though it's gotten so much cheaper and more efficient, we don't need as many people. We don't eat that much more. Maybe we try, but there's not just that many more apples you can eat in a day.
And you can't have that many more olives grow on a particular tree, so you don't need, if a machine can pick them 10 times.
You could grow more, but who's going to eat them all, right? Exactly. So that's very intuitive. Lower prices, less spending. But the opposite can happen, and you see it in your company and elsewhere. Whereas the price gets lower, the curve can be very flat.
Yeah.
That we call that elastic. And so even just a small drop in price leads to a big increase in quantity. So like one that I think of, we were talking earlier. You flew in here on a jet. It used to be that pilots were relatively inefficient. They could only go a few hundred miles in a propeller plane. Jets make them able to have way more passenger miles.
Yeah.
Does that mean we need fewer pilots? No, because now we fly all the time, the drop of a hat. And so that increase in quantity more than compensates for the fall in price. Now, in the economy, there's lots of goods and services in each category, elastic or inelastic, and sometimes even within an occupation, like software engineering. Parts of it are inelastic, like entry-level coders seem to be we don't seem to have as much demand for them as the models allow them to get more work done. More senior coders, actually, there's more demand for them. And so it's growing. And I can't give a complete roadmap of where they all are because some of them need to be discovered and some of them are, this is a job of entrepreneurs and this is why you have a decentralized economy. People are trying to figure out, are there new goods and services that haven't been invented yet that will be really, really valuable? And I'm glad that there's a bunch of people around here in Silicon Valley trying to figure those out. Frankly, some of them try things that just fail. And that's okay. And others try things that end up being 10 times more valuable than we expected.
And so if you're an employee or if you're a boss, really the message should be use these tools, become as efficient as you can. And it may increase demand and it may increase wages and it may increase the number of people who are employed, or it may not. But if you don't, somebody else is going to do it and outcompete you.
Exactly. I am constantly talking to senior managers of big companies and telling them to focus not just on the bottom, cutting costs, but also on creating new value. And certainly my advice to individual people is that's the side of the curve you want to be on. 2 weeks ago, Stanford senior came to my office and she was like almost in tears. She was really distraught. She said that she didn't have a job. And she said her classmates didn't have jobs. And she was like, literally said, is my generation doomed? Like, what are we going to do about all of this? And I told her, well, look, absolutely, there's a lot of jobs that are disappearing. I'm not going to paper that over. On the other hand, there's so many new things that she could do and that her classmates could do that would have been impossible a year ago or 2 years ago. These tools allow them to create a ton of good for the world. I encouraged her to lean into that. She had come for office hours for my class. And then in the middle of it, she confessed she actually wasn't in my class. She just wanted some advice. But I said, you should have signed up for my class.
All right,
this is what we talk
the
about.
student's amazing if they did that. So this is what your student should do.
She's high agency. I get that.
She should start a company. Say she's a Stanford grad doing a stealth startup, raise $5 million, and she's pretty much good, right? Like this is a business model.
A lot of the students are doing stuff like that. I mean, you skipped over the middle step, which is to have like a good idea that actually creates value. I know there's a reputation that VCs are just writing random checks. I don't think that's quite true. But if you have a good idea, and there are a lot of good ideas, there's so many good ideas.
Let's go back to, you had two very interesting bits that came in that I don't know if they contradict, but they're certainly interesting when put together. So you mentioned while you're going through your 4 theories that you did a study of call centers and AI helped the employees at the bottom.
Yes.
And then later you mentioned that with engineering, it seems like entry-level employees are not getting hired, but more senior people are getting hired. So in one example, call centers, the people at the bottom are doing better than the people at the top. And the other, general engineering, the people at the top are doing better than the bottom.
Right.
Why is that?
It's a good question. I have 2 answers that are not necessarily consistent with each other, but I'm going to just put them both out as hypotheses. So one is that, look, different industries, different occupations, different things happen. And you don't have to have a grand unified theory that like affects every single industry the same way. And I definitely think it's the case that in some cases, entry-level people are helped more. In other cases, senior people are helped more. We happened to do a study where we found that entry-level people were more affected. That said, I can't resist trying to come up with a grand unified theory about what's going on. So I think part of what's going on is that the technology is especially good at capturing tacit knowledge and making it codified. So in the case of the call center, what it was doing was looking through millions of transcripts of successful calls and saying, oh, here's a good way to answer that question about how you change your password. And it was sharing that with everybody. Now, for the new workers, they're like, oh, that's a great way to answer that question. And they got a big benefit. For the more senior workers, they're like, yeah, no kidding. That's what I've been saying all along. That's where you got that answer from. So they weren't really getting much of a benefit because they were just getting back what they were saying. That tacit knowledge that was in the transcript somewhere was now being codified, but it wasn't as big a help for them. For the call center people, that was helpful to the less experienced people. They were able to be more productive. But for the coders, it was also taking some of that knowledge that had was being codified, and it was sort of saying, okay, now this is how you do it. But now the machine was actually executing on that in a way that they didn't even need the coder anymore. So it wasn't just showing them how to do it, it was beginning to do it.
So, okay, wait. So in some ways with the coders, it's the same thing because you do get a bunch of tacit knowledge. Like this is how you file a JIRA ticket at this company, and this is how we do QA
now it's
and all
codified.
this stuff. But the difference is for the coders, the AI is actually doing it, but for the call center, wouldn't the AI be doing it too?
It's beginning to. So
this may be an artifact of time. It may be the case that
I think so. I think a lot of occupations go through this, multiple phases where first AI can't help at all. Then AI and humans working together can create a lot of value,
and then it helps the people at the bottom rung.
And often it could. I mean, I don't want to say that's always never where the case, but it often does help people at the bottom rung. And we can go into when it would, I'll say it right now. So there's also cases where if there's sort of like a right answer, like this is the best way to answer that question about the, password, then it lifts people up to that. You can't get better than answering the question right. So then it's going to help the people in the bottom more. The top people, there's no room to improve. There are other things like in science where like, we don't know where the ceiling, we're way far from the ceiling if there is a ceiling. And then oftentimes it helps the best people more because it helps everybody get better. And it's not like you've maxed out on the best answer. And so in those cases, AI can help the really good performers as well as the beginners. Sometimes the good performers more.
I remember a study that showed this, right? And it was by a guy at MIT. But the
well,
study was fraud, right? Have we
fraud.
actually shown this in a real study?
It hasn't been done in a careful study as it should be.
I mean, it's theoretically, it makes sense.
Exactly. I see it in the field when we see people. And in fact, for some of the coders, we see that happening, that there are not some really good coders or 10x. We had Andrej Karpathy here at my house last week.
Wow.
He's one of the guys who, he coined the term software 2.0. He's very into it. He may be one of the best coders on the planet. And he says he's become, 10x, 100x better by using these tools.
And he also vibe coded a chart on which jobs are going to be replaced, tweeted it, went to bed, woke up and realized it had gone completely viral in a way he didn't expect. So
he should expect it because almost anything he says, is worth going viral. He was super insightful. But he's an example. There are many other people like that. As you probably know, some of the coders adjacent to him are getting these, $100 million pay packages. And the reason they're getting them is not because the companies hiring them are charitable or, just dumb, is that they think that they can get a ton of value by leveraging
okay, that's a
those
super
people.
interesting question. So I saw a guy who used to be a top executive at one of the big companies last night, and I asked him what he thought the effect of AI on jobs for coders would be, and he gave me an answer that surprised me. He said he thinks it will be extremely deflationary. Or not deflationary is the wrong word, but it will suppress wages of people at the top because the folks at the top will still have more knowledge.
Right.
But they'll be running the same agent farms, using the same models as everybody else. And so maybe only 10% of the input will be a human input and 90% will be code. And so if everybody has that, then they'll be paid less, to which the answer is, okay, but even if it's 10% and you're operating this massively powerful machine, maybe you can make the massively powerful machine so much better and it should increase your wages. I'm curious what you think. For high-end software engineers, will they be paid more or less in 5 years?
More.
More.
Yeah. So I disagree with that person's analysis. Most people have this intuition, we sometimes call it the lump of labor fallacy, that there's a certain amount of work that needs to be done. As you get more efficient, you need fewer people. And as we said earlier with the inelastic demand, that sometimes happens. I'm not saying it never happens. But I think for those high-end coders, I look around, there's so many opportunities, things that haven't yet been coded, invented. I mean, my wife is creating some, others people are creating them. There's so much opportunity that I don't think we're hitting up against the wall where we've run out of good ideas to do. So I think those people who are 10x more productive are going to create massive new value. I mean, there's a little story I tell in my paper, The Turing Trap. It's hard for us to imagine what the new things are that are coming in the future because we don't see them yet. But if you go back in history, there was this mythological engineer named Daedalus. He made wax wings. He also apparently made robots that were so lifelike you couldn't tell them from humans.
Yeah.
So I did a little thought experiment. Suppose that he had taken those robots and had them create all the things the ancient Athenians were making. So clay pots, as many as you want. This room could be piled with clay pots, tunics, chariots. If you were sick, no problem. They would make incense for you and you would, replace the doctor. So no one would have to work anymore. Everything would be made. But very quickly you can see that all these clay pots and incense, it's all free, but it's not really much of an increase in living standard. Almost all of the reason that you and I are better off than the Athenians is because of new goods and services, new things.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be true going forward as well. There's so much new stuff that needs to be invented, that is being invented, and that's where most of the energy and the invention should go.
There's a theory that I subscribe to, that there is yes, that's all true. Yes, we are going to invent things we haven't figured out. Society's going to change. Wonderful stuff will be made. But there's a rate of change. If you had 100 years of change in a month, it would be absolute chaos. If you had 100 years of change in 99 years, it would be fine. What is the speed of change that we can absorb as a society? And then how do we make society more resilient so we can absorb a higher speed of change?
I think this is the biggest problem we have right now, is that we have a huge capabilities overhang, that the models already are so powerful that if we just implemented what they could already do, that would be complete revolution in the economy. That's why I'm optimistic about productivity.
Yeah.
But I'm worried that it's going to happen so fast, it's going to be super disruptive. There's this big gap between the capabilities. I'm going to do another graph here in the air. There's a big gap between the capabilities and then our institutions, our skills, our economic understanding. Right. And that gap is where most of our challenges lie. That's why we created the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, is to try to close that gap by catching up. I think there's going to be a huge amount of disruption. Even if we have that happy story where there's a bunch of new jobs being created, even as old jobs are being destroyed, which I'm sure is going to happen, moving from one to the other quickly, we're not good at doing that. We have a very
That's the great line. It's prehistoric brains, medieval institutions, godlike technology.
That's right. My old professor, E.O. Wilson, said that. And I think that's right, except now it's turbocharged. He said it, I don't know, he said it like in 1980 or something.
I know.
But it's even more true now that the technologies are vastly more powerful than what he was able to see. And so this mismatch is going to create a lot of chaos, and we need to work super hard to understand. One of my frustrations is, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe trillions, at pushing the capabilities. God bless my smart friends who are doing that, but we're not really investing comparably in trying to understand the transition. And there's lots of examples in the past where we got it really terribly wrong, and a lot of people were hurt, and I see us barreling towards a similar outcome if we're not careful.
So you're an economist, you're not a policymaker, but if you were to change some of the rules for economics or give advice to companies and you want to sort of reduce this overhang, what would you say?
I do 4 things. So first off, I've thought about this before, so sorry, I have this little checklist. So first off, I just think we need way better measures. It's a tragedy that the government is slashing, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the people. This is the exact time we want more visibility, not less visibility. Right. At the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, we're creating a set of AI economic indicators. We'll be releasing them in about a month that will give people sort of visibility into what's happening. Because it's one thing to predict the future. We can all make predictions sitting in a room, but getting real-time or close to real-time data so you can sense and respond.
Like a shadow AI BLS is actually not a bad idea.
Yeah, and it's not meant to replace them. It's really a complement because we have all sorts of administrative data from ADP is a partner, and so we have tens of millions of payroll records, employment, wages, moving between. So we can rely on that.
All right, so that's number one.
Data. So that's number one. Number two is making things more dynamic. So what I would do is our economy, sadly, has actually become less dynamic. There are more frictions. There are fewer people moving from company to company, region to region, job to job than there were 20 or 30 years ago. And as you have these big shocks, you need to have more flexible labor markets. And we could do things like have portable benefits, job training and job transitions that make it easier for us to adjust to this shock.
So Erik, you should leave Stanford. You shouldn't be at the place where everybody else is studying this. You should
I just moved. I moved here from MIT, so that was my job
MIT,
transition.
you need to go to University of Montana, spread this out across the country. All right, number three?
Number three is we need to lean in to complements, not substitutes. So, I mentioned earlier the Turing trap idea. Way too much of the technologists and of the people like the CFO I talk to are very focused on using the technology to just replace humans.
I am totally with you on this. And I also am mad at the AI companies because I feel like they have designed AI to be as much like humans as possible as opposed to being the most efficient complement as possible. But go on.
Yeah. And I think you actually can direct technical change in this way to make it more suitable. And you can direct the adoption of the technology in these ways. So it's more of a complement, not a substitute.
Right. So if you're a CEO, as I am, instead of, okay, what is the AI tool that I can use to most easiestly replace, Bob and Sally? What is the AI tool I can use that can make Bob and Sally maximally efficient, right? That's the way to go.
I was just talking to a group of CIOs, chief information officers, at dinner last night. And they said, how can we get our workers to buy into this more? I said, well, first off, stop telling them you're going to use it to replace them. Yeah. How many workers are going to be jumping for this thing that is going to replace them or their best friend at the desk next to them? But use it to tell them that you can amplify it and do a better job.
So this is the super lit dinner why we have to do this podcast a little late in the morning because you're going to be up until 3 a.m. with the CIOs? That's good, Erik.
In that call center case, I talked about how it was more productive, more answering questions. Customers were happy. We had better customer satisfaction. We also did this thing called sentiment analysis. You could look how many happy words and how many angry words. But the third thing was that the employees were happier too. There's less employee turnover. So, I guess it's more fun talking to happy customers and solving their problems than not being able to. So this can be a win for all three groups if you do it right. And too many people I think Alan Turing, brilliant guy, but I think he sent us in the wrong direction when he said the purpose of AI or the test of AI is to how closely it can imitate and mimic humans.
That and then this obsession with AGI, right? And like that all companies seem to believe. I feel like the CEOs read too much sci-fi and they're too focused. The reasons why you would want to make AI like human intelligence, like it's easy to interact with. Human intelligence is like the coolest form of intelligence we know.
Yeah.
But there's a real reason not to do it.
Right. It's a pet peeve of mine. AGI, like, it has become a synonym for human-like intelligence or superhuman. And I can get why that's an easy benchmark, but most technologies complement humans. They don't replace humans.
Right.
And AI is no different. AI is actually very spiky. We all see that it does some things, like it's incredibly brilliant at like doing, analyzing all sorts of text and data, and then it's incredibly dumb. Used to have trouble spelling the word strawberry or whatever, or counting the number of R's.
Math, it's terrible at math.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very unusual. And humans, by the way, we're spiky too. We just don't take. There's some things that are easy for us. Buttoning a shirt is easy, very hard for machines. Instead of trying to work on having machines do things that are hard for machines and easy for humans and work on that frontier, we should work on having machines do things that are easy for machines and hard for humans.
Right.
That would make them more of a complement. And then we would each have something to contribute. And collectively, as a team, we'd be able to do a lot more.
Yeah.
And so the fourth thing I recommend is just, creating like Centaur benchmarks and other tools that allow us.
You may have to define a Centaur benchmark.
So a Centaur, I guess I read too much Greek mythology, half human, half horse. But in my context, doing work with Andy Hopt, it's half machine, half human. And most of the benchmarks out there, we just came out with that Stanford AI Index. We collect all these benchmarks, and they're like, how well can the machine do this by itself? And then they take that machine and they put it into a hospital, reading medical images, and it fails terribly because it's not designed to work with the radiologist, work with the humans. And in most cases, what you should really be doing is, how can we come up with a benchmark that is the human and machine doing the task better than the machine alone or the human alone? If we had those kind of benchmarks and we had those kind of targets, I think we'd do a lot better.
But what would be a specific example of that? Like, give me how could you use a benchmark like that to improve medicine?
The obvious thing in the case of medicine is just that instead of having the benchmark, how well does this particular AI system recognize cancer as a black box? How well does a human working with it recognize? And so what it would have to do, it would have to explain, like, I see something in this image that looks wrong, and the radiologist would look at it and say, oh, wait, what you're seeing is an eyelash that fell on the image. Like, just ignore that. Or you may be right. And having that back and forth. So it needs to be interpretable and understandable. Like an example, Dan Hendricks came up with this great thing called the Remote Labor Index, where he's looking at tasks on Upwork and seeing how well an agent by itself can do those tasks.
Yeah.
It's only like 2 or 3% right now that AI can do all by itself. And what we're working with them is saying, look, it's fine. That's interesting how well the machine can do it just like as a black box. Why not see how much better they can do it when a human and machine are working together? I'm sure it's going to be better than an agent by itself, at least as good.
Yeah.
And it's going to be better than a human by itself. And that's the frontier, especially in things like science and creativity, in marketing, in lots of those places, there's room to create new kinds of value that have never been created before.
Let's talk about your big Canaries in the Coal Mine paper. You referenced it earlier. It's one of the most discussed papers in AI this year. Explain what you found, how you did it. You mentioned your partnership with ADP. Explain some of the pushback, and let's talk about where the debate is right now.
Like everyone else, we were reading all these headlines, anecdotes about thousands laid off here, there. There's millions of jobs that disappear every month, jobs that are created every month. So if you're a half-decent journalist and you want to pull together a storyline, you can find an anecdote that will support that storyline. Lots of anecdotes. We want to get some grounded data, like what's really happening. And I'll be clear, when we first looked at it, we didn't see much. If you look at the top line, there's not that much happening. There's ups and downs, there's noise. If you look at the government data, there's not that much happening. And we were almost going to write a paper that said, okay, we're not seeing anything yet. But then my very smart students and research scientists, Ryu Chen and Bharat Chandra, like they dove in a little bit more deeply and said, oh, wait a minute, there's parts of this where there's like huge things, like it's striking. In particular, if you subdivide the data by rank every occupation by how exposed it is to AI, there's a way of doing this. My friend Daniel Rock and the team at OpenAI created this GPT's paper that ranks every task in the economy. If you look at particular occupations like coding or call centers, they had 12 to 15% declines. In fact, if you take all the top quintile, the 20% most exposed occupations, they had about 11 or 12% decline.
in the 22 to 26 cohort?
In the 22 to 26 cohort. The other cohorts, nothing really.
And now, one critique of the paper was, well, the data actually starts in 2022, so it can't be because of AI. Like the decline
starts then. Yeah. So
because ChatGPT
I think that's a good concern. So a couple of things. That's just like the raw data. And I think there's actually a number of things going on, the pandemic, interest rates that are also happening around that time. So
right, because it could just be a cohort of people, they've gone through college during the pandemic, people don't, maybe their social skills have been degraded, but who knows what it is,
there's a bunch, and
of course, that wouldn't explain why AI-exposed jobs are they're hiring fewer as opposed to non-AI-exposed
jobs. So we
jobs.
want to, so there's definitely a lot of things. We're not saying AI is the only thing that ever happens in the economy. We talked earlier about other things that are happening. So we did a couple of things. One, we explicitly tested the main hypotheses. We looked at interest rates. We looked at the pandemic. We looked at remote work. We looked at the tech sector. And each time when we controlled for those, the effect was still there. In fact, in the case of interest rates, it was funny because there's this paper criticizing, saying, oh, this is all interest rates. And so we looked at the jobs that are most exposed to interest rates. Someone else had already made a listing of which jobs are most exposed to that. And we looked at the jobs most exposed to AI. They're actually negatively correlated. If anything, it goes the other way around. Like construction jobs, very exposed to interest rates, not very exposed to AI.
Okay.
So, so if anything, that would strengthen the result. But then we did something a little bit more, econometric. Like we use this technique called fixed effects, where we basically control for everything other than the AI that might vary across it. And when we put that in, it was interesting. What happened was that the time shifted back a little bit. It started happening more like in 2024. So my interpretation is that...
Which actually makes more sense intuitively because it shouldn't be the case that because ChatGPT comes out and everybody's like, cool, but also it told me to, put a burrito in my, VCR.
Right. A lot of, exactly. So it seemed implausibly early before. So my interpretation of the data when I look at the totality of it is that there's a bunch of weird things happening in 2022 and 2023. AI may have been part of that, but it was mostly other things.
Right.
The pure AI effect really started getting noticeable in 2024 and 2025. And now it's getting steeper and it's statistically significant, even when you control for actually the entire melange of other things.
So what I'm most interested in is whether, this makes sense to me, right? It seems like it fits with my model of the world. But my model of the world would also say it's a temporary effect. And that what will happen is that these young people will be better at using AI. They'll start new companies. And some of the companies that haven't been hiring young people are going to be like, wait a second, you hire an engineer straight out of college and they've been AI native for 5 years. Actually, they crush it. And so maybe it reverses due to cultural and educational reasons. Or the universities will change.
The universities need to change. Look, I talked to a bunch of companies and I was embarrassed when they told us that we at Stanford and other universities were not graduating people who understood AI. In the classes, these techniques are not being taught. They're being taught the fundamentals of, say, coding, but they're not really being taught to be working with, Replit and Cursor and the tools. And so we are retooling our curricula to keep up with that. We should have done it sooner. But that's one of the reasons they weren't hiring a lot of people right out of college. Some of them, of course, the people with high agency were doing it on their own. But the broad mass of people were not as trained as they should have been. I think you're right. That will change. More people will lean in from an early age.
It's super interesting. When you talk about this bigger societal question of how you set society so it can handle the change, if this story is correct, your data is correct, and the story I'm sort of telling myself is correct, it suggests that part of the failure point is these Byzantine institutions, universities that didn't adapt themselves to this godlike technology quickly enough, so they produced students who then weren't desirable in this economy, right?
Right.
But that changes. Universities see what's going on, so then they produce students who are actually way better, and then the data you've seen reverses, potentially.
Well, there's a lot of hypotheticals there.
About 100 of them stacked on top of each other, Erik. But we're just talking on a podcast here.
It is totally plausible to me. And I met with the board of trustees at Stanford and our president, John Levin. And I said what you said, that's what we should be doing. I hope it happens. I hope it happens fast enough. My experience is universities change really slowly. In my class, everyone uses AI. I lean in. I don't try to stop them from using AI.
Right.
And I wish all faculty we're leaning in equally, but
have you
they aren't.
seen? Okay, this is an interesting question. So in journalism, or a question that is interesting to me. In journalism, I am convinced that AI is an amazing tool for research, right? And I wrote this book. I didn't use it to write for ethical, spiritual, all kinds of reasons, legal reasons, but I use it to edit and all that. What I have not seen yet is I have not seen a kind of mid-tier journalist become a top-tier journalist by using AI, right? Maybe it's out there. I just haven't seen it. Like, there's not somebody whose work I've thought was like pretty good, and now they're using AI and their work is great. Has that happened in economics? Has there been an economics professor or researcher where you're like, damn, they must be using these tools really well? Or is it just like you were a top researcher before AI and you still are?
Look, there are a lot of young researchers
Yeah.
that are doing amazing work, and I know they're using AI. And I don't know what the counterfactual would have been. Like, if AI hadn't been around, would they still be like blooming and blossoming right now? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, like my own students, the ones who worked on the Canaries paper, they use AI a lot. They bring stuff to me, and they're 10 times faster. I use it. Look, here's like, let me just explain how my workflow. It used to be, and still to some extent, like, I have an idea. I talk to my grad students, my co-authors, my researchers, say, what about this? And then they go back, and then like a week later, we meet again, and they're like sort of an update. And that's sort of like the clock speed. Now, very often, I sit around with Claude up until late at night, and I'll have a hypothesis. I'll get it running like you do, and then like 20 minutes later, it'll come back with all this data, and I'll say, "Oh, that's interesting. No, but what about this other thing?" And so the clock speed is just much higher. I see it in my own work. I know there's a lot of other people. There's definitely a lot more research being produced. I think some of it is really good. Unfortunately, I think it's even easier to create bad research, right. And the journal editors are being flooded with mediocre stuff.
Right.
Now, in there's some gems, and like what we need to do is come up with new institutions to filter those out.
So, have any like fundamental advances been made in economics research through AI?
I'm not aware of any.
Right. I guess it would be hard if I used AI and I came up with like a great new theory of, I don't know, worker displacement. I wouldn't say Claude did this, not me. I would just publish it.
I know people do, some people really lean in and talk about how they're using AI. Look, I'm working on some papers right now that I think are going to be like very important, and AI helped me a lot. And I think it would have been hard for me to work on those without them.
How much would you have to be paid to not use AI?
Oh, it would...
like a month's salary, 2 months salary, a year's salary?
No. It would be so low. I could barely. I would have to get a different job. Like I feel like I couldn't compete. Part of it is, I've made some life choices. I'm not like trying to like maximize my money. I would do my job. Don't tell my dean this. Like, I would do my job even if I wasn't paid. I just love my job. I think a lot of my colleagues are like that too. There's like not. For most of them, I don't think there's any amount of money that would allow them, they would feel comfortable slowing down their ability to do discoveries.
Okay, let's talk about your recent paper on robots and the minimum wage. So
sure.
In this paper, you studied geographic regions that are next to each other.
Right.
And identified places with higher minimum wage in place A as opposed to place B.
Right.
And then looked at the adoption of robotics. And you saw that in places with a higher minimum wage, companies are more likely to invest in robots.
We work with the data, and we had this particular question we wanted to look at robots. So we looked at robot adoption, and we looked at plants. And as you said, we wanted to see how minimum wage was driving changes in adoption. And you can look at like plants that are on either side of the border, like between Illinois and Indiana or whatever, where one state raises a minimum wage and the other doesn't. And these plants may be only like a few miles apart. And so we're hoping that sort of broadly they're sort of in the same labor pool, et cetera. And what we found, as you mentioned, is that when states raised the minimum wage, those plants were more likely to use robots in their factories.
That's so interesting, right? And so basically somebody who runs a plant is like, okay, well, I can hire a worker, but it'll cost me $18 an hour instead of $16 an hour. So I'm going to hire 200 instead of 300, and then I'm also going to put on these extra robots.
Well, we don't know. Yeah, just to be clear, the first part, we didn't measure whether they're hiring a different number of workers, but it may be that in order to justify the higher wages, they need to make the workers more productive.
Oh, I see.
And so it pushes them to think, okay, how can we get this worker to do more productive work?
Right. If the worker
And so
costs $18
there's a broad
an hour.
story in the literature that in general, these forces that make labor more expensive, they also push the companies to think of ways of making workers more productive.
Okay. Let me ask you a big question about where this is all going. So there's a world where if you look out 10 years in the future, 5 years in the future, there's a world where AI has really increased productivity, right? And American economy, world economy, where things are more equal, right? But it's all more prosperous, right? And there are all these new jobs and young people are happy. And then there's a world where it's chaos, right? And
both can be true.
right. But what would be the indicator? What is the leading indicator that would tell us which path we're on?
Yeah. So I would actually combine those two as the most likely scenario, but we have a lot of choices. I think I'm pretty optimistic that productivity is going to get better. I also think there can easily be a lot of chaos.
Yeah.
And that there's no guarantee we're going to have widely shared prosperity. We could have greater inequality. And one of the things, so some of the things I look at is like the productivity metrics, the capital labor ratio, the adoption of these technologies. Those are all going in the direction of more AI, more performance. But at the same time, that same capital labor ratio is beginning to show that fewer workers are employed, and we're beginning to see certain category and less of the GDP is going to wages and salaries, and more is going to capital.
Yeah.
And it's still early, but it's striking because for the past 200 years, that ratio has been almost constant. In macroeconomics, they teach something called these Caldor facts, and one of these facts is that the capital labor ratio is pretty constant. Through steam engine, electricity, all these amazing technologies.
Seriously?
It's kind of weird, isn't it? Surprising that it's been a fairly constant. But if you understand Cobb-Douglas production functions, you're not as surprised. But recently, like the past 10 years, it looks like the labor ratio is beginning to fall. Mm-hmm. I could easily see that falling a lot more. One of the things I worry about is we're not paying enough attention to that kind of a risk of not just in terms of incomes, but also economic power.
Yeah.
I worry that the technology is disempowering a lot of workers, a lot of citizens, because most of us get most of our income from labor income, not from capital income. And if capital becomes the main way, that's going to tend towards a smaller group of people having the economic power. That probably will also lead to a concentration of political power.
Right.
And that is kind of a trap that I worry a lot about. I think we have some choices. We talked about some of the policies earlier that would help steer us towards a better outcome. But I think we should be paying more attention to how to use the technology to create widely shared prosperity. That's why I teach my courses on using these tools to create new kinds of value. But I think not enough people are.
We want the
going
call
that
center
way.
story where everybody is using the tools, but the people who are paid the least are getting the most benefit.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit of a cautionary tale about the call center story. That paper was done, with data a few years ago. It came out last year. We're working on a new paper, and I don't want to steal the thunder of this new paper because it's not done yet. But in the new paper, the company is mostly using AI agents to answer the questions directly. Only a few of them get escalated to humans.
Right. So then you end up having fewer people.
And then you end up having
That's a tough
fewer
transition.
people, and oftentimes the customers are very happy to talk to the AI agents. It used to be a couple of years ago, I hated talking to the automation agents because they were so bad. But now, if you've talked to some of them, they're actually pretty good.
The craziest thing I heard was from someone at a major tech company who said that they've now realized that people like talking to their AI agents when they know they're AI agents because they no longer feel like they're wasting the person's time. And so they've rejiggered the AI agents in their call center to try to push the conversation to upsell the customer. We're going to get the customer for 20 minutes. Let's get all their data and let's upsell them.
Some people want to be very chatty, and it's really annoying for a human call center agent who's measured on average handle time.
Yeah.
But an AI agent, they have a lot more time.
Let me ask you another big question, which is, in my industry, one of the big questions is how much should the creators be compensated for the value of the AI models, right? So the AI companies came and they read all the journalism created by The Atlantic, and they read all this copyrighted material. They claim they have a fair use right to it. We claim they do not. Courts will decide. But regardless of what the courts say, how could one determine what content creators and what Wikipedia writers are fairly owed for the value created in AI?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I know you've been thinking a lot about it. You're involved in some of the organizations that are helping that. I've been thinking a lot about it with one of my other postdocs, Gabriel Unger. But we're not looking at this from a legal point of view. We're looking from an economic point of view. We just want to start with a blank slate. What would be the optimal outcome? And the way an economist, or these economists, he and I think about it, is you want to set it up in such a way that you create incentives for as much value creation as possible. And regardless of what the current laws say, what you'd like to do is provide incentives for people to create valuable content, because the LLMs, they need that content to become better. And if nobody created valuable content, it wouldn't be good for the LLMs. It wouldn't be good for society. And so if you screw the content creators, or if you give them nothing, you could have a problem. And so we've created a model where we look at the different incentives that different parties need. You also need downstream incentives. The LLMs have to invest on their side, and they have to get some value. And based on how much value is created by each of the parties, you want to allocate the incentives there. Now, there are some scenarios, by the way, sorry for content creators, where they aren't that important. Like maybe a lot of content is duplicative, you can just look stuff up, or maybe even there's synthetic data where the LLMs can, for some types of questions, figure it out on their own. My sense is that for a lot of investigative journalism, there's no way the LLMs could do that on their own. For other things like physics and facts, whatever, that stuff is kind of easy to duplicate. But depending on how much work you want to put into creating the content, you have to reward people and give them incentives in different ways. So we're suggesting that maybe there's a new regime that isn't based on fair use or copyright, the existing laws, but based on what incentives you want to provide. And I've actually talked to some of the folks and some of the senators and others about that. Current copyright makes it illegal to make a copy of something. But that doesn't really take into account the incentives to create it. It could be that it would be useful to have to compensate people if you use something, even if you don't make a perfect copy of it, because you're drawing on that Wikipedia or other person.
So there's a couple of very interesting elements of it. There's the one, how do you keep incentivizing people so that they can creating the content that then is also fed into the models and makes the models better. And then two, there's this question of how much do you compensate for the data that they initially trained on. And what's interesting about synthetic data is the companies are using synthetic data and training their models on it. But they're only able to make synthetic data in version 5 because version 2 was trained on the original creator content. And so you can use synthetic data instead of creator content only because you initially used the creator content. So in some ways, it's like you have to compensate the grandfather.
Maybe. That's not always true. I mean, there's places where there are kinds of the classic example is AlphaZero. As you may know, they trained it. First, they did train it on human game players who played the game of Go. And AlphaGo was trained that way. AlphaZero, they just fed in the rules and they filled in some algorithms. And they didn't need any human content at all, and it performed super well. Now that's a very special case, but it's become broader and broader as they get better and better. So for mathematics, for coding, if you have something that is a verifiable output and you can generate different outcomes and then verify it in some way, you can start generating really useful synthetic data.
Okay, but how would you back of the envelope? AI company is worth $100 billion. How can you determine how much creator content contributed to that $100 billion value?
I thought that was going to be really hard, but then as I talked to some of the people at the Frontier Labs, I won't say their names, but they think they can do it. Not perfectly. You don't have to attribute every single item to every single person, but you can do statistical modeling. You know about ASCAP and BMI, the music things, and they pay music creators when something's played, and it's done statistically. So what you do is when somebody does a query and asks a question, some percentage of the time you try and trace back which pieces of input, and there's something called ablation studies where you see how well would I have answered the study if this content was never contributed versus how well do I answer the question with it. And the difference between the two is an estimate of the value.
And then
you
say, okay, so you determine how much are your customers paying you. I mean, Pro Rata does this a little bit where you take an answer and you sort of work backwards and figure out who contributed what. So the big AI companies are also looking at that, and they can figure out, all right, so
noisily. And
if we excluded all of Wikipedia,
yeah,
our answers would have quality A as opposed to quality B.
Bingo.
People are willing to pay us. And then your study of how much people are willing to pay gives the value to the customers. You can do a reverse on the value to the companies.
You do that, exactly. But this one is important because ultimately what we want to do is create incentives for, creating more value. So I think it's usually couched in terms of like one group, these billionaires against these millionaires and, fighting back and forth, or maybe I guess a lot of content creators aren't millionaires, but publications. And there is a sort of a division of the surplus story, but to me, the more interesting one is how do you make the pie bigger?
Yeah.
My thesis advisor on my committee, Oliver Hart, he wrote these. He got a Nobel Prize for doing work on how do you allocate property rights in order to create as big a pie as possible. And it was mostly like he was thinking like physical things, but it can apply to intellectual property rights too.
This is such an important product. All right, last question, Erik. I asked this of all my guests. If you had an unlimited research budget, what would you fund in AI?
Look, I would fund how do we make this transition? I mean, look, and it starts with a better set of metrics, but we are barreling at light speed towards a huge disruption. And the investment in the technologies is going faster and faster, and there's barely any in understanding the transition. And the reason I think that we need to pay attention is that we actually have choices. I don't think it's this thing that like AI is just going to do something and we just have to watch it happen. And I think so many people, I talk to the optimists and the pessimists, and they make the same mistake. They're, in my view, a mistake, which is like, well, it's either going to be really good or it's going to be really bad, and like that's the way it's going to be. I believe we have incredible agency, but we're squandering that because we don't understand well enough what our choices are, which ones matter, which ones don't. Like we're just talking about, what are the right incentives we could set up to create more value. And the deadline is approaching. Like pretty soon, like the teacher's going to say, pencils down, what's your final answer? Yeah. And we are not anywhere near prepared to do that. And so I'm glad I'm hearing more and more nonprofits, government are beginning to pay attention. I've been working so hard with Anton Koronek and Ajay Agrawal to get more economists to take this seriously. I'm part of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and we've created a new initiative on the economics of transformative AI. And there's a bunch of really smart economists that are now working on different components of this. But we need to accelerate it a lot faster.
That's a great answer. It's partly why this podcast exists, right? To have conversations that help us make better decisions.
I appreciate you helping.
Thank you so much, Erik, for joining The Most Interesting Thing in AI.
Been a big pleasure.
I know I'm going to keep following Erik's work because he's answering these really difficult questions. What do you think? Will AI make us better at our jobs? Will it cause job displacement? Maybe both? Let us know what you think in the comments. And also add, there have been a lot of really good comments on these YouTube videos. I jump in, I read them, I respond. Keep them coming. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for more, and thank you for watching.